I just want to say thank you to everyone. Welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here. And just to reciprocate with Randy, I just appreciate our partnership with HCI so much. We do here at Fierce really appreciate the time that we get to spend with you. So as Randy mentioned, I work for Fierce. I'm a master facilitator, and I've been facilitating Fierce now for over 9 years. And I come from a career that's pretty rich in organizational development, learning, leadership development, executive coaching. So the topic that we're discussing today, which is how to build a more accountable culture, is a very familiar topic for me and something I've been discussing and working with leaders on for many years. So we've got a lot to discuss today, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you. So let's begin with what we know. What we know about accountability. Accountability is a huge challenge in business today. I hear it all the time. The word comes up quite often. The Workplace Accountability Study recently revealed that 82% of respondents feel they have no ability to hold other people accountable. Okay, and in addition to that, this study also revealed that 91% of respondents rank accountability as one of the top development needs they'd like to see at their organization. So, simply put, we all want it, accountability. We all want more of it, but we don't feel we have the ability to actually get it. So, let me ask you, HCI community, a few questions, because I want you to consider the following. In your workplace, do people do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it? Or do you struggle with a culture of, it's not my problem? In addition to that, when a mistake is made, are people able to admit that mistake willingly and move forward? Or do you find people saying, well, if she, he, or it were different, I'd be just fine. I'd be just fine. Consider that for yourself. I want you to sort of start to create that connection between accountability and what's going on in your organization. And in addition to that, I'm going to ask you the same set of questions, but now I want you to think about yourself. As an individual, as a leader, how are you showing up? Do you do what you say you're going to do when you're going to do it? Or you find yourself saying, well, it's not my problem. Go talk to IT, or go talk to HR, or go talk to the leadership. In addition, when a mistake is made, are you able to admit that mistake willingly? Is that something you do consistently? And then you can move forward? Or do you find yourself saying, well, if she, he, or it were different, I'd be just fine? Right? Now, I want to, we're not getting any responses from this, so it's easy to tell ourselves, oh, yeah, I'm absolutely showing up in a way where I can admit my mistakes willingly. But I want you to think about that for yourself, because many leaders that I work with, that we work with at Fierce, say they work in a world of little to no accountability. That's one of their biggest arguments. And that finger pointing is at an ultimate high, right? And while employees want responsibility, they're quick to pass judgment or blame when they experience less than ideal results, or they screw up, or something goes wrong. And many employees would probably argue the same thing about leadership, or just simply point to leadership altogether, like I had said a few moments ago in my example. So regardless of the position or decision-making power that you hold in your organization, today we're going to shift this commentary a little bit, because we're going to take that finger pointing and we're going to turn it in the direction of ourselves, which can kind of get a little uncomfortable, which I hear. But if we want to make progress, this is really where the resolution begins, with ourselves. And we're going to talk more about what that means and what that looks like in a moment. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to share and talk a little bit about what do we mean when we say accountability. What is it anyway? And more specifically, why this connection with Fierce? So I am from Fierce Conversations. We are going to be talking about the connection with Fierce, but what is it, and how does Fierce define accountability? At Fierce, we've really worked with thousands of leaders over the years, and we've helped them to create the business culture that they want, but more importantly, the business culture they need in order to get results, in order to succeed, in order to maintain that competitive advantage. So we've heard leaders describe accountability over the years as this: culpability, responsibility, wrongdoing, even blame. Basically, bottom line, if this all goes wrong, who can I blame, right? Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this isn't a great commentary to get me to jump out of bed and rush into work every morning. I don't want to be the one in this scenario to be raising my hand and saying, oh, me, I want to be the one that's culpable, or I want to be blamed. Sign me up for that, please. The current cultural definition of accountability is getting in our way. It creates little to no employee engagement the way we've defined accountability. If you can think about it, when you hear the word accountability, sometimes do you cringe a little bit? I mean, we want accountability, and yet I think sometimes when it's demanded of us, or we're demanding it of others, it feels a bit uncomfortable because we're not quite sure where we fit in that picture. I think the current definition of accountability is actually sucking energy instead of adding energy into our workforce. So we're going to dive into that a little bit more with some more research and data, but I want you to consider now how we define accountability at Fierce. We're going to shift this just a little bit. At Fierce accountability is a bias toward action. It's an attitude, a personal, private, non-negotiable choice about how to live your life. True accountability, fierce accountability, is not about legislating accountability. It's not about throwing down that hammer or holding someone's feet to the fire, so to speak. In fact, the reality is, as much as we may want to, we can't hold people accountable. Until a person sees how accountability serves their needs and they choose to be accountable, then the most we can hope for from those individuals or that person is resentful compliance, an undercurrent of quote-unquote victim, or the it's not my problem culture, right? In victim mode, I use that word, so I want to describe what I'm talking about. When I say victim, I'm not saying that we're calling people victims, but there is something to a victim mode or victim mindset. And this is the belief that I can't deliver the results I want because of realities outside of my control. It's not about me. It's about him, her, them, that. It's outside of me. If it weren't for the fact that my boss is a horrible leader, I'd be successful at work. If it weren't for the fact that my peer hates me for whatever reason, I'd be easier to work with. The accountability mindset, as we think about fierce accountability and we shift it, is given my current reality, what do I need to do to create the results that I want? So given that perhaps my boss isn't a wonderful leader or doesn't have the greatest management skills, what do I need to do in order to get the results that I want, right? In short, you can be given responsibility. We're all given responsibility when we sign up for our jobs. We're given that little thing called a job doc, and it has all of our responsibilities listed out. We're given responsibility, but we have to take or choose accountability. So I want to hear from all of you. We're going to do a little bit of a poll here. Let me run through the questions, and then we'll flip you over so you can make your vote. But I want us all to take this concept of fierce accountability and actually apply it to our own unique worlds. So the poll question that I'd like to have you answer is this. How would you describe the level of true accountability, the way I just described it, in your organization? Okay, so you have three choices. One, we're nailing it. We foster an environment with a true sense of responsibility to motivate one another and work together to achieve our goals. The second choice is, well, we're working on it. We realize the importance of accountability, but we're really struggling to promote that true culture of it in our workplace. And number three is we've lost it, or maybe it never existed in the first place. There's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lack of ownership throughout the organization. In other words, accountability is nowhere to be found. So I ask you to vote on this. I'm going to turn this over to Randy so she can pull us over to the polling site and share just a few brief instructions with you.
Thank you so much, Beth. As a quick reminder, HCI members, you can participate in the poll by logging in or registering to Poll Everywhere with the widget on the left-hand side of the page. And it just takes one simple click to nail in your response. So it looks like quite a few of you are already participating, and let's get some feedback on these results from Beth. Beth, what are your thoughts here?
Awesome. Thank you for that, Randy. Yeah, so it seems like we have some people voting in all three different categories, and I just want to thank you up front for your candor on this. Here again, we don't know who's voting what, but everybody seems to be voting, and we've got most people in that middle result, so we're working on it. For those of you who feel your organization has nailed this accountability thing, I want to take a moment and applaud you, and I mean that sincerely, because I don't think it's an easy thing to acknowledge that, hey, yeah, we've really nailed it, we've come a long way. My question to you today is, how do you sustain that? So how do you ensure that true accountability sticks around, not just today, but tomorrow, the day after that, the day after that? And so the 3 tips that I'm going to walk you through today, the intent is to help you do that, to sustain what you've already built, both for yourself, for others, for the organization. If you're working on it, which looks like the majority of us, we're working on it. We know it's important, but we're struggling a little bit. Or perhaps if you say, you know what, we lost it. It is gone. Remember, and I'm going to remind you about this throughout, is where do you have power, control in this situation to help start making inroads into building that culture of accountability? It starts with you. And those 3 tips that I'm sharing are leadership tools, skills that are necessary to build and support accountability in your organization. And for those of you that may be sitting there still on the other side of the screen from me saying, well, this is nice, but I'm really not in a position to affect this sort of change, or this sort of accountability movement in my organization is out of my control. As they say, I'll remind you of something that I heard a long time ago, which comes in very handy in this situation. If you think that you're too small to be effective, you've never been in bed with a mosquito. So while that may be a bit humorous, in all seriousness, I want to take the next 30 minutes and empower ourselves, all of us, with some skill, with perhaps a new mindset, to start building that culture that we're seeking, that accountability that feels so elusive. And we do all have the power to affect that. Sometimes it doesn't seem that way, but we'll be reminding ourselves today of how we can. All right, so thank you, Randy, for bringing us back. And as we move forward, then I want to talk a little bit about why fierce. Here again, it's not the biggest question you came here with today. The biggest question was, what can I do to create accountability? And the fierce answer to that is simple. The key to greater accountability lies in the conversations you are or are not having with yourself and with those around you. Conversation is the key. So here again, at Fierce, for those of you who don't know much about us, we've worked with clients from all industries, small businesses, global players like Starbucks, Coca-Cola. We've even worked with school districts and many universities. And our reach is worldwide. So we've been to many, many countries around this world, and through all of our work with all of those clients, we have learned one very important thing, if not many, but the one most important thing is that what gets talked about in a company, and even more importantly, how it gets talked about, determines what will or won't happen. Determines what will or won't happen. Business is fundamentally an extended conversation with our colleagues, with our employees, up the chain of command, with our customers, and unfortunately, as we start to think about the importance of conversation, many of the conversations that are so critical to our success, that help us build that accountability into the system, fail, or they don't happen at all. They don't happen at all. And we've had companies who've had entire projects stall, amounting to thousands of dollars of lost revenue, because people are pointing fingers. People are too busy figuring out who to blame instead of having the conversation or conversations with each other to propel their results, to propel the organization, to propel their team forward. And if that sounds remotely familiar to you, keep listening, because we're going to talk a little bit about how we can make this better. The question I have is, what are those missing conversations, right? I said conversations, sometimes these conversations aren't happening. What aren't we talking about? Well, I'll add a little bit more data to share with you from the Workplace Accountability Study, which is that 93% of employees don't really understand what their organization is trying to accomplish. I want to pause for a minute and let that settle in. I was surprised when I saw this data. 93% of employees don't really understand what their organization, that's not 50%, 40, that's almost 100% are saying they don't really understand the direction their organization is going or what they're trying to accomplish, right? And in addition to that, 85% of leaders aren't defining what their people should be working on. And an equal number of employees crave that clarity. They need that clarity. So to me, these are pretty substantial statistics. When you're talking about missing conversations, what happens when these statistics or these missing conversations play out in an organization? Well, we've actually had the opportunity to experience that because many of our clients have come to us with certain pain points. very strong ones, actually. So the following are things that many of our clients have come to us with and really are the results of when we aren't having these kinds of conversations. The first is that we lose great people. We lose great people. You know, talent doesn't tolerate a lack of accountability, especially when there's a lack of clarity, when there's lack of direction, they leave. So we lose talent. We lose our talent pool. We lose our bench. Projects, strategies get derailed. When a clear line of sight is anything but clear to employees, when expectations aren't clearly defined, initiatives suffer and projects fail. So you see those projects, those strategies, those initiatives suffering. Another pain point that we've experienced with our clients have experienced is that there's a loss of trust. So when employees question what their organization is trying to accomplish, and more importantly, how they fit into that picture, and when leadership isn't talking with their teams to create that shared meaning, trust disappears. And ultimately, so does accountability. If I don't know what's expected of me, I don't know how I'm being measured or even what direction I'm headed in, or perhaps even the why behind where we're going, then I'm going to be the last person that wants to raise my hand and say, ooh, I'd like to be culpable for this, or I'd like to be accountable for this, right? And we end up eroding and losing trust. Trust with each other, trust in the system, trust in leadership, whatever that looks like, there's a loss of trust. The good news is, because this is a really sad, tragic picture, right, that I've just painted for you. So the good news is, it doesn't have to be this way. In fact, there are so many leaders and organizations out there who are creating that positive working environment where their employees are truly engaged, they're productive, they're innovative, high levels of trust are being built. We've worked with those organizations. There may be many of you on the line today. The big question is how? How are they doing it? They're having fierce conversations. They're having the difficult but necessary conversations that drive results for their organization. So here's the question that's probably running through your mind. If conversations are so critical to building that culture that I'm looking for, how do I do it? How do I ignite those conversations? And what do I need to do, more importantly, to ensure that those conversations are building accountability, that that's happening? So this is where we start to enter into those 3 tips. 3 fierce tips. The first tip to building an accountable culture is to build trust through leading by example. Now, these are going to be big tips, but I'm going to break them down for you in a few do's and don'ts. So I want to make sure they're actionable for you, that you can take these out and actually start using them. So build trust through leading by example. We just talked about how trust and accountability go hand in hand, right? So there was a past CEO of Pepsi by the name of Craig Weatherup, you may have heard of him, who once said, you can't create a high-trust culture unless people perform to their potential. Unless people perform to their potential. Based on my professional experience over the years, I would add this. People won't perform to their potential if you haven't created a high-trust culture. And I think I may have actually, I'm going to back up for a second because I'm going to repeat that so everybody can read it. You can't create a high-trust culture unless people perform. Then I'm going to say, people won't perform to their potential if you haven't created a high-trust culture. That's what we've experienced at Fierce, is this potential that people have that gets eroded or gets sidetracked if you haven't created that trust in the system. If as a leader you're legislating accountability in others but you don't show up to the party yourself, you'll run the risk of not succeeding. You run the risk of not succeeding. So how can you begin to build that trust, to show up accountably yourself, and thus guide other people to that accountability? Because remember, we said you can't legislate it. You can't hold people accountable, but you can guide them to choose accountability for themselves. So the first step in this is to not validate excuses. Don't validate excuses. It's really hard not to go down the excuse lane. It can be really tempting, even cathartic as a leader. But excuses in the end just lead to a greater lack of the accountability that we're looking for. The truth is, if you don't want excuses to exist in your workplace, in the system, You can't feed into them yourselves. Let me share an example with you to hopefully help describe this a little bit more. A young manager finds herself frustrated that her team is not delivering projects on deadline. So it seems that every time someone comes to her with a setback, she finds the solution is to provide empathy, right, to validate their reasoning. So she practices empathy because she can see that that reasoning is based in some form of truth or reality. There's truth to the excuse. She finds herself saying things like, well, I know the budget isn't where it should be, or I understand we do have a lot of projects on the table, so of course, it's going to be difficult to meet that deadline. But her frustration lies in the fact that while she's practicing empathy, the excuses keep coming and the results still stay the same. Things aren't getting done. Now imagine if that same manager responded to her team with the following. Okay, well, given that the budget isn't where it should be, or given that we do have a lot going on, we're a bit overwhelmed right now, what can you do? What can you do? Instead of just acquiescing to the excuses and saying, well, okay, I hear you, we're going to be late to deliver on the project, what if the manager had said, I hear you, and what can you do about it? Or what can we do about it? Fierce accountability is a choice. It's a non-negotiable choice that someone makes about how to show up. And the beauty is that you can create that environment where people choose to show up fully and committed. But for your team to do their part, you have to do yours. And by validating the excuses, you're not supporting that culture that you're looking for. Instead, shift the conversation and empower that action. Empower the action that you're looking for. It doesn't mean that you can't acknowledge the fact that there are certain realities taking place. The question becomes, how do we expand upon that and start to focus on the action that we can take? So don't validate excuses. Do have a self-performance conversation. So here's a question for you. As you think about your current role, do you have curiosity around your own performance? Do you ask those questions? Do you know where you stand with yourself, your leader, your direct reports, your colleagues in relation to all of your work and your efforts? Sometimes the key to a more accountable team actually requires that we ourselves as leaders change our own behavior. I know a leader at Fierce who formally asks her team for one area of focus or feedback every quarter. And her intent is so she can continue to improve her leadership, so she can continue to support her team's efforts. And she credits these conversations, these quarterly conversations, with helping her stay the course, to keep on track and assess how she's really doing. Not how she thinks she's doing, but how she's really doing. See, so often I hear from leaders, well, nobody's saying otherwise, so things must be going pretty well. Or from individual employees, well, my boss hasn't told me I'm not doing a great job, so I must be doing a really, really good job. These quarterly conversations from this fierce leader make her a stronger leader for her team, create a more unified team altogether. She doesn't know what she's going to hear from everybody every quarter, but she trusts that that feedback is going to lead her and her team to better results. I also want to add that you don't have to wait until something is formally scheduled to have the conversation. So whether you're an individual contributor or you're a leader, the question is, how do you get feedback on your efforts? And are you doing that regularly? Or are you thinking to yourself, oh, I'll just wait till my annual performance review, which of course we know, based on a lot of dialogue that's happening in organizations, is being eradicated. We're moving toward that culture of having more ongoing feedback conversations. And how are you doing with that? Are you asking for that? Feedback is not always the easiest thing to hear, and a lot of times when we ask, we're not quite sure what we're going to get. But truly understanding other people's perspective helps us unlock potential. Unlock potential for ourselves, unlock potential for our team and for the organization. I had a client actually ask me this week, it was really timely, in one of my sessions. He said, we were talking a little bit about micromanaging and delegation, and he said, how do I know if I'm a micromanager? I don't even know if I know if I'm a micromanager. Is there an assessment that I can take? Is there some questionnaire that I can take to find out? And I paused for a minute and I said, yes, there is an assessment you can take. And it entails having a conversation with your employees, asking them, how am I doing? Am I giving you too much time or oversight? Do you need a little bit more distance? How does that feel for you? Let's talk about that. So I think it's first of all, as we start to think about leadership and we start to think about accountability, that topic of feedback is interwoven into everything we're discussing here. And my question to you becomes, as you think about all of this, who will you ask? Who will you ask? My challenge for you today is to have a conversation with your boss, a direct report, a colleague, about specifics that have to do with your performance. Ask for feedback. See, now is the time to get curious. Like, again, oftentimes I hear, well, I'm not hearing anything, I must be doing fine, I'm just going to coast until the end of the year. But if you do that, and you're not checking in regularly, you're operating in a bit of a fantasy land. And that fantasy land is filled with assumption. It's our own perception of what reality is, not how we're impacting others or our results, which is not where true accountability is found. I also don't want to raise my hand and say, I want to own this, when I know that my leader isn't showing up the same way and saying, hey, where can I do better? How can I help? How can I support? What can I do as a leader to support all of our efforts and to get us there? So who will you ask? Okay, so that's tip number one. Tip number two, coach to accountability. We hear this term coaching left and right. I know it's a big one. I know many people have different definitions. And as we start to think about coaching, I'm going to talk to the fierce level of coaching. And when I say, how do you take a coaching approach to accountability, adopting a coaching approach and guiding others to embrace accountability really does help us lead to levels of personal ownership and performance. And when you adopt a coaching approach, it's important to keep a few things in mind. And that's what I'm going to discuss today. Don't give advice. Okay, so for those of you that just cringed, let me share a little bit more context. How many of you love to give advice or be the expert? Many of you would probably say, well, I'm in my role because I am the expert, and I have been through it, and I have my leadership experiences, or I do bring that level of knowledge with me, so of course I'm going to give advice. So why is it that the feel-good parts of our job as leaders, like sharing our expertise or advice, are often the wrong things to do? Giving advice is actually one of the worst things that we can do when people come to us with problems. It's the worst thing we can do. When someone comes to you with an issue and you go straight to advice giving, you're training them not to problem solve or do the critical thinking themselves. You're training them not to use their brains effectively. I want to back this up with a little research because I can hear the groans on the other side of the screen. So David Rock, who's the founder of the Neuro Leadership Institute, which for those of you who don't know is an institute that's fascinating. It brings together both leadership experts, which David Rock is, and neuroscientists, which Jeffrey Schwartz is, but it brings together both of those minds and starts to talk about how do we behave as leaders in a way that's going to be more effective. It takes that brain science, puts it together with that leadership expertise to really start to create the behaviors that we need to succeed. So this research that they did and put into the Neuroscience of Leadership, which was an article, said that for insights to be useful, they need to be generated from within, not given as conclusions. And they say this is usually achieved through some solution-focused questioning approach that facilitates self-insight. Enter coaching. So in other words, when you give advice to someone, it's basically landing on a dormant or quiet brain. Okay, so if you're handing someone your wisdom, handing someone your advice, their neurons aren't firing at that moment. They haven't been forced to start thinking to turn their brains on. So what happens is it really goes in one ear and out the other. When people are able to give themselves the advice, to actually do the critical thinking for themselves, then they create that self-generated insight, then they're more likely to implement change, to take ownership of their actions. And ownership equates to accountability. If you continue to give advice, which you can, I'm not saying, and please don't walk away here thinking to yourself, Fierce is now telling us we can never give advice. Because that's not the case. I know as leaders, we need to be sharing our expertise and our advice, but I ask you to be more aware and intentional about how and when you give advice. Because if you continue to lean on advice giving as your strategy and approach, the knock is that if your advice doesn't work, or it doesn't work out well, people are going to, well, surprise, they're going to point blame at you, they're going to point blame at others, and they're not going to take ownership for it themselves. A huge accountability gap is created when we're not engaging with our employees at that level where they can start to critically think for themselves. And in fact, what happens, and some of this research points to it, is that when we're able to critically think and problem solve for ourselves, we start to create patterns in our brain. And those stick around, they don't go away, they're stored forever. So that when we encounter a similar issue or problem or a decision, we're able to go back to those patterns and pull on them. So this creates sustainable, talk about sustainable accountability. This is what starts to create that day after tomorrow, after the next day, the next day, the next day level of accountability. So here again, don't give advice. Do ask questions, lots of them. And then when you think you're done, ask more questions. The key to an effective coaching approach is to go into what we call it here curiosity mode. Dig deeper. Put your ideas, your assumptions, your concerns aside and shift the conversation. And I will say that is one of the hardest things to do. When we are in a position where we feel as though we know what the right thing is for that individual to do or the next action they need to take, it is so difficult to put all of our experience and assumptions aside and let the other person work through it for themselves. And in order to succeed, when you want to create that culture, that accountable culture, the best way to succeed is to help the other person find their own answers through your questions. So you're having the conversation, you're just shifting your approach. You're shifting your approach. I'll just share with you a few of the most effective questions I've heard, I've experienced, I've used. Coaching. I don't have them on a screen, but I'm going to share them with you just because they've proven to be pretty powerful. So if you want to jot them down, please feel free. One of them is, in what ways do you have control over this issue? I think I may have used that word a little bit earlier on in this hour. But this is not what don't you have control over or what's limiting you right now, but what do you have control over? Another one is, if nothing changes, what are the likely implications? And more importantly, how can you prevent that from happening? Finally, if you could turn back time, what would you do differently? What would you do differently? All of these are powerful questions, and they all have the potential to ignite that accountability that you're looking for. So consider those when you're faced with someone who's dealing with issues or who's not willing to show up to that accountability place or the level that you're looking for to take accountability. Instead of giving advice or telling them how they can or how they should or how you did it, what if you started with questions? What if you started with, and advice givers, just beware, because it might be tempting to start asking leading questions, which are questions, but they're questions in the form of advice. So in other words, don't ask, have you considered doing this or that, because that's advice. Instead, ask, what have you considered doing? What have you considered? These words that are up here on your screen, what, how, why, those are very powerful questions. And then end the conversation by asking, when? But what are you going to do next and by when? And then sit back and watch accountability shift. Because as you start to ask people to take control and ownership of solving those problems, of taking those actions, that's when true accountability presents itself. So here again, don't give advice, do ask questions, and lots of them. And number 3 is to delegate effectively. And here's another word where when I even say it, I can feel that the face is cringing when I say the word delegate. What does delegate that mean in your organization? When someone says, go delegate that, or I'm going to delegate this to you, what type of feeling or response does that elicit? For most organizations that I've worked with, that we've worked with at Fierce, this statement translates to something like, well, go get rid of a task you currently own that you don't want to do it as fast as you can. Which leads me to what not to do when you're delegating, because we want to talk about how to delegate effectively. So one of our clients used to lovingly refer to delegating as dele-dumping, and that really stuck for us. This is when you say, let me take all of these tasks that waste my time and throw them on your desk. And for those star dele-dumpers, this can be accomplished without ever really making eye contact as they run away as quickly as possible. It's a drive-by dumping. And we've either experienced that, which is why I find this humorous, because you've experienced that feeling, or maybe you've done it, maybe not intentionally, but you have done it. The thing is, delegation is often misused, and often it's an underutilized form of development. Delegation can actually help you develop people and increase accountability if it's done right. So when you flip delegation from the dump and run mentality to something that can actually help you build capacity and strengthen your team, it gets the energy flowing, right? A great question to get this conversation going with yourself is this: what is the one thing that you personally are not doing at work that if you had the time to do could actually change your results for the better? And that's a big question. One thing that if you had the time to do it could change your results for the better. Now, the follow-up question is almost as if not more important. What needs to come off your plate to do that thing? What needs to come off your plate to do that thing? These are two very powerful questions that can be asked as well from leader to employee or within a peer group or just to ourselves. But these two questions, when answered in a thoughtful way, provide people the opportunity to grow and those around them the opportunity to grow. So if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, that's great, Beth, but I'm an individual contributor. I don't have anybody to delegate to. I'm going to ask you to get resourceful and think about changing the conversation with yourself. So when you think about what you're currently working on, what new things would you like to take on? And how can you streamline what's on your plate or have the conversation with your boss or your colleagues to actually shift responsibilities? Because you may be surprised, a responsibility that you currently do that you're actually pretty good at, but is no longer the best use of your time, may be the perfect next step for someone else. It may be the perfect next step for someone else. And if you're still struggling with what to delegate, I have a simple activity for you, but I'm going to tee it up first. Most leaders I talk with believe that there aren't enough hours in the day. I'm sure you probably feel the same way. Given that, it's really important to start to take a look at how am I spending my time? What's on my plate? You know, if you're thinking about planning a budget, and we all just came out of budgeting season, right? If you're thinking about planning the 2017 budget, you kind of need to look at where you spent your money currently or in order to plan ahead. And delegation or managing your time and your capacity is no different. It's really important to start to assess where am I spending my time and is it the best use of me. Oftentimes we delegate with an approach of I'm going to delegate the items that I don't like or that I don't have passion for or that I'm not really all that good at. And in fact, the key to true development and accountability is to delegate responsibilities that you are passionate about and you are good at. And I hear some of you saying, whoa, hold on, did you really just say I have to give away the work that I love? So let me just put it to you this way. Who wants to be told, I am so glad you're on our team because now I can hand off that monthly report that I always have to create that I really hate doing, but hey, you're going to be great at it. Instead, what if you heard, I'm so glad you're on our team. I want to include you in the planning for the annual leadership meeting that's coming up because, well, first of all, it's my favorite event of the year, and it's so critical to the success of our organization. I think you'd be a great thought partner with me on this. It's funny because this example really reminds me of a time when I was in my early 20s. It's a very simple example, but boy, does it still haunt me today. I started off early on in my career. I was in an executive admin position, and I was supposed to be planning a leadership luncheon. And I had the leader of mine at the time who came to me and said, believe me, I'm so glad you're here because whenever this responsibility gets put on my plate, I hate it. Because not everyone is never happy with what you order for lunch. Someone's always complaining. You never fully succeed. And at that moment, not that it ever hit me before, but I thought, I don't want to do this. I don't want someone not to like what I chose for them to eat for lunch. And to this day, it haunts me. Because if I have to plan something for someone or a party, for me to order food or try to figure it out, it gives me this awful sickening feeling in my stomach. And it's a funny little example, but I think what it does and what it does for me is it helps to identify that when we're being delegated to, the approach that's taken, how you get delegated to, means the world in terms of what you're being asked to do and the responsibility you're being asked to take on. So take some time, and here's the activity that I want you to think through. When you're thinking about delegating, I want you to think about your top 3 time takers, and most specifically, these need to be something you enjoy doing, something you're good at, and something that's important to the organization. And I bet that once you start thinking it through, that this activity with these parameters around it is much harder than just identifying what items you're just willing to let go of. I mean, these items could actually be some of the favorite aspects of your job. But the question becomes, how can giving these items to someone else open up my time for other gratifying work to come to me, for growth opportunities to come to me, for me to increase my capacity and focus on other things that would be really important and critical to the future success of the team and the organization. And not only that, but how can giving these items to someone else actually help serve their development? When we start delegating this way, it benefits everybody. It benefits everybody. Strong delegation, what we have found at Fierce is we do talk quite a bit about delegation in our workshops. Strong delegation is at the core of companies that have strong employee engagement, that are able to fluidly work through change and lead through change, and who have high levels of performance on their teams. So take some time and reflect on your current responsibilities, and specifically, where can you create development opportunities through delegation for yourself and for your team members? Where can you create development opportunities for yourself and for your team members? Not just dump it and run, but really create that development opportunity. So let's sum this up, because we've gone through 3 Fierce tips. We've talked quite a bit today about what's going on with accountability and some important key data points, but let's talk specifically about what you can do walking out of here. The first thing is to build trust through leading by example. So don't validate excuses. Don't be part of that problem, but instead, open that conversation up by saying, yes, this is the reality, and what can you do about it, or what can we do about it? And then do have a self-performance conversation, asking for feedback. Ask for people to really share with you your impact or how they're experiencing you. The second is to coach to accountability. Don't give advice. Don't give advice. We talked about that. And instead, ask questions, lots of them. How do you start to enter with a curious mind, and instead of telling people or sharing your wisdom, imparting your advice, instead, as David Rock and Jeffrey Schwartz would say, allow them to generate their own insight so they can start building those patterns in their brain so that they can start to solve those problems and own the solutions moving forward, which again leads to greater accountability. And finally, delegate effectively. Don't dump. Don't dump and run, but do identify those top 3 time takers. Specifically, make sure you're thinking about what's important to the organization that you're doing, what you're good at, what you love to do, and how you can start to look at that differently. By giving some of that to a team member, how do you open up your own capacity, your own time to start bringing in additional responsibilities or work that you want to be doing that would be really important for the organization? So think intentionally about what to delegate to others. Bottom line, before we move on, because I want to get to Q&A, but building a culture of accountability really requires that that companies, organizations, go back to the basics in one key way. It's about having the conversations. And I know the top leaders that we're working with, the organizations that are really nailing it, are realizing the impact that the art of skillful conversation can actually have as a way to heighten levels of accountability and employee engagement. And I talk about employee engagement, they go hand in hand, right? And then also that all leads to trust in the workplace. You can't have high performance if there's not trust. And as we start to look at what creates accountability, those are 3 factors that play together. So here is my call to action for you. As you walk away from here today, what conversations have your name on them? And or in what ways can you shift the current conversations that you're having to get the results that you're looking for? Because remember, true accountability can't be legislated. We can't say you have to or else. That doesn't work sustainably. It might work in the short term. Fear is a great motivator. But true accountability lies in the fact that accountability is a choice. Someone shows up and chooses it. So choose to engage in those conversations that you know are critical to your success, that are critical to your team's success, and start opening that level of dialogue, those conversations with everyone on your team. So With that, I want to share before I turn it over to Randy, and we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A, but I want to thank you all for being here today. More importantly, I want to share a free ebook, excuse me, a free resource with you, which is an ebook that you can access on fierceinc.com/HCI accountability. It's called The Financial Rewards of Employee Engagement, Better Relationships Bring Results. We talked a lot about the connection between engagement and accountability, and specifically trust. So building those relationships and getting the results you're looking for. I think you'll find it a really great resource and supplement to what you heard today. So feel free to go and download that. Again, it's free, and we encourage you to do so. And if you've got additional questions and want to reach out to us, we also encourage you to do that. You can access our information on fierceinc.com. And with that, I will turn it over to Randy now so we can start a few minutes of Q&A.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Beth, for being here to share your expertise on this topic. I think there were some very valuable takeaways that we'll all be able to implement in our personal and professional lives, so we appreciate you being here to do that. We have had quite a few questions come in over the course of the webcast, so we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the time we have left here. HCI members, if you haven't yet submitted any questions for Beth, please do so now. Remember, you can enter those in that Q&A box right there on the webcast page, and we will queue those up and get through as many as we can. So Beth, let's get right into our first question, and this is a great question, and I'm glad we're going to start out with it. This question comes from Jackie, and she asks, how do you convince the C-suite there are trust issues when they don't see them? And if they are a part of the trust issues, how can you demonstrate that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, right? So the question becomes, how do we start to influence or at least expose what's really going on, the realities that are going on in our organization with the people that are actually making those big decisions. So I don't have any quick and dirty answer for you in terms of how you can actually work with your specific leader, but what I will say is I always go back to what we talk about at Fierce, which is it starts with the conversation. So often I've experienced leaders who say, well, I know this needs to get discussed. I know I need to bring this up. I know we need to have a rich conversation about this, and here are all the reasons why I'm not going to do that, because we've been there, or I know what they're going to say, or I know what their answer is going to be. And so we avoid the conversation altogether, which of course leads us to no opportunity for growth or results or movement at all. And I often talk with my classes when I talk about this sort of stuff, the risk that's associated when we're not opening up this conversation versus the potential benefit if we do and we start making inroads because those conversations are successful. And so I always bring a level of curiosity to the table. We often say, as part of Fierce, one of our objectives is to interrogate reality and provoke learning, and that includes sharing what the reality looks like from your perspective and also being able to hear what it looks like from your leadership or your C-suite's perspective. So it starts with the conversation. That's the bottom line. And it's one thing to say we can make a cultural change when they are able to show up differently versus I see a conversation needs to take place, so I'm going to invite it to happen.
Great perspective, Beth. Thank you so much. Let's jump right to our next question here from Alice. Alice asks, how do you build trust when the workforce is mostly virtual? When you have lots of home workers, is it out of sight, out of mind?
Love it. So I actually am a remote worker, so I love this question. And I worked in it with a workshop with a group of sales individuals this week that were all remote workers, and so we had a lot of wonderful conversation about this. And I had one really bright individual who was on the call this week that said, you know, we're at a disadvantage. We've got the burden because we're remote workers, and it's really tough to build those relationships and build trust with our teams when we're so remote. And so being a remote worker myself, I would say, yep, that's the downfall, right? Being able to work from your home or from a remote office, the downfall is it's not so easy to holler across the cubicle or to run into somebody in the hallway and have that level of conversation. So it becomes a deliberate action. And one of the things, and Luis, if you're listening right now, I'm going to call you out. One of my colleagues, Luis, who's actually remote as well as a master facilitator at Fierce, said something that really stuck with me, and it resonated because I am remote and I feel this every day. But he said a critical part of building those relationships, regardless of where you are, even if you work at the home office but you are traveling so much and you happen to be remote in that sense, is to remind yourself to keep the conversations warm. And I loved that. I actually have it as a sticky. I'm a sticky note girl, but I have it posted on my screen because it is a deliberate action that, as a remote worker, is intentional for us to take to build relationships, and then for the boss, for the leader who has remote people on their team, to also understand that keeping that conversation warm, picking up the phone instead of sending that one-liner email, or doing things such as scheduling those one-on-ones with video versus just with the phone. Keeping those conversations and those connect points warm is the key to continuing to build that relationship. We always say at Fierce, the conversation is the relationship. So the quality of the conversations that you're having directly impacts the level or the quality of relationships that you're building with others. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking.
Great feedback there too, Beth. A lot of folks at HCI are remote as well, and it's always great to make sure that we're having those warm conversations, even if it's something, maybe not necessarily work-related, just keeping up with what's going on in each other's lives, I think is important when you don't get to see each other face-to-face all the time. So great question, I agree. Let's take a look at our next question here. This question is from Cassie. I think this is a great one as well. And Cassie would like to know, can you ask specifically for critical feedback? My people tend to only say nice things, which is fine, but I'd like critical feedback to grow.
Yeah, I love this. And we talk so much in Fierce about feedback because it's one of those key components, right, in terms of knowing, am I on track? Am I getting to the results I want? What's going to keep me on that direct course to my results? So I love this because oftentimes we say people who are not used to giving feedback, or even, in fact, if their boss asks them to give them feedback, one of the things is a lot of times people will dip their toe in that water just to see if it's swimmable. So I often say to leaders, whatever kind of feedback you're getting from people when you ask that, acknowledge it, thank them, appreciate it, and see it as the next step toward building an even more confident and feedback-rich culture. So I also would say there is a level of, in terms of how we build trust with other people and on our teams and in our organizations, being able to ask for it, but also maybe even being able to populate that yourself. So when we say, hey, here's something that I think I probably could have done a lot better this year, and I look to you as a partner in my success to give me some feedback on how I could do that better. Even being able to add to that conversation in a way by opening ourselves up and being a little vulnerable as leaders can help to expand the conversation and allow people to say, oh, okay, they really are serious when they say they want me to give them critical feedback. The other thing I just say, and I'm not necessarily saying that people always do this, but I would just check myself if I were a leader where I have a team that's just giving me the niceties, because I would ask, has there ever been a time maybe in the past where someone did give me critical feedback and I responded in a way that could be preventing people from wanting to give me that in the future? I'm not saying that's the case, but it's always important to reflect and think, how have I behaved in a way in the past that may be predicting the experience that I'm having right now with my team? If not, then how do I continue to open the door through my actions for more critical feedback? And maybe that's being vulnerable and sharing where I know I haven't quite hit the mark, right? So, and then asking my team to partner with me to work on that in the future. So that would be my recommendation. Here again, I always say to people, I'm one person. I've worked with lots of leaders. I certainly don't profess as sort of having all those answers, but I have all those experiences, and this is my my suggestion. I wouldn't call it advice. And in the end, it comes back to keeping those conversations going. If you're asking for feedback once a year, it may be less productive than if you're asking for it on a weekly basis or a bi-weekly basis and keeping that conversation going.
Great, amazing answer there. Thank you so much, Beth. I think we have time to squeeze in one last question. This one comes from Shane on the topic of delegating. Shane asks, how would you suggest factoring in what the person you are delegating to wants to work on or could benefit from the exposure?
Yeah, so I hope I'm answering this question correctly. So it starts with the conversation, right? So when you're talking about delegation, what does this individual want to work on versus what's the priority for the organization, or what exposure do I think they need to have? It all begins with a dialogue. First of all, to check to see if you're in alignment on either of those. And then it's truly about building a plan. And here again, at Fierce, we do a lot of work around delegation and helping leaders identify, or at least be able to learn the tools that they need to facilitate that conversation. So what are the levels I'm delegating out to? Because there's also this all or nothing approach, where as leaders we sort of cringe. I don't feel that they're ready, or that this is fully the right place for them to go, but I just have to trust, and they'll either sink or swim. Well, we don't necessarily see that as the best solution either, and our tool really helps people to determine what are those levels that I can be developing or delegating out to, and how do I keep in close contact with my team members to continue that development conversation. So here again, I would say the first step is the conversation. It's what do you want to be doing versus what are the priorities, and how do we start to create a plan that marries those so that we can get you developed. It's so funny because he's probably listening right now too, but I'm having this dialogue right now with my boss, and one of his questions was, what is it that you want to be working on next year? And more importantly, what are you passionate about? Because I don't want to build a plan with something that, you are not excited to work on. And granted, sometimes we have parts of our jobs that we just don't get super excited about, but for the most part, how do we as leaders start to build with our employees plans that not only meet the business goals and the business initiatives for the organization and where we're going, but also take into effect what they're passionate about? And that begins with the conversation. So it's a great question. Thank you for that.
And Beth, thank you so much for having this great conversation with all of us today. We have come to the end of the hour, so we're going to wrap things up for now. I know there are quite a few questions that all of you submitted. Thank you for doing that. We didn't get to them all, so we're going to pass those on to Beth so she can follow up with all of you offline a little bit later. I do want to encourage everyone to continue this discussion on Twitter with the hashtag HCI Chat. You can also take a look at upcoming HCI events by clicking the Attend a Conference link at the top of this page. And to wrap things up today, I'd like to say one more thank you to our presenter, Beth Wagner, Master Facilitator at Fierce, and also to everyone at Fierce for making this webcast possible. Of course, the biggest thank you of all goes out to all of our HCI members. We appreciate you taking the time out of your afternoon to participate in our webcast today, and look forward to seeing all of you on another webcast soon. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.